Hello, my name is Scott McDaniel. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Dayton, where I also earned my PhD in theology in 2018. My university email is on the title slide if you would like to contact me after watching this presentation. I also hope to see everyone at the streaming Q&A on August 4th. You'll notice that there's a slight change in the title of my presentation, particularly the last clause there. Today I'll be presenting Quotidian Insubordination, Rural Space, Environmental Belonging, and Appalachian Plurality. In the winter of 1931, the Black Mountain Coal Company instituted a 10% wage cut for its workers. For the company, this measure was necessary to maintain profitability amidst a national and global depression. In response to the cut, itself one of many grievances, local miners organized a wildcat strike and abandoned the mines. Already suffering from low wages, poor living conditions, and starvation, the miners were fully aware of the pecuniary motivations of the company's actions and knew the extent to which the operators would go to protect their profit margins. Having participated in a similar strike in 1922, a number of miners recognized the need for organized support and appealed to the United Mine Workers of America, the UMWA, District 9 President William Turnblazer for aid. Turnblazer passed on the miners' request to National Vice President Philip Murray, and a mass meeting was organized for March 1st in Pineville, the county seat. While Murray pledged support and agreed to represent them before the company, he did so in a spirit of cooperation and insisted that the striking miners form a chapter of the UMWA and reject any antagonistic or revolutionary action. For Murray and the union leaders, addressing the miners' grievances and advocating for reform required a measure of conciliation. The same spirit was operative when the UMWA and Bituminous Coal Operators Association, the BCOA, signed the National Bituminous Coal and Wage Agreement in 1950, which initiated a profound transformation in the relationship between capital and labor. Focused on securing the equality of mine jobs, John L. Lewis and the national leadership prioritized stable wages and health welfare benefits, in turn helping initiate what Brian McNeil describes as the, quote, labor brokerage phase, unquote, of the UMWA. The goal of this period was to, quote, achieve the best deals possible with the industry, unquote, and to this end, Lewis and the union leadership were relatively successful. However, as Lewis accepted the growing mechanization of the industry, he also guaranteed the reduction in the number of mining jobs available in the region. The emphasis on continuous mining, which precipitated a productivity increase of 100% in a 10-year period, also made the industry more vulnerable to interruptions. According to William Cleaver, the stronger labor militancy, roving pickets, increased violence against property and scabs, the refusal to work, that developed in the 1960s was in many respects a direct response to this development. Changes in union leadership further precipitated the intensification of labor militancy and diversification of union concerns. With the retirement of John Lewis in 1960, Thomas Kennedy was elected president of the UMWA. Well liked but in poor health, Kennedy was a figurehead and stepped down from the position in 1962. While he had functionally performed the duties of president since Lewis's retirement, Vice President Tony Boyle officially assumed the position in 1963. Following the brokerage model of union leadership, Boyle demonstrated a clear unwillingness to act outside the official relationship with operators, and his negotiation of the 1964 contract helped set off a wave of wildcat strikes throughout the region. The disaster at Consolidation Coal's No. 9 mine, in which 78 men were trapped underground following a methane explosion, and the growing Black Lung movement inspired Pittsburgh miner Joseph Jonk Yablonsky to challenge Tony Boyle in the 1960 election for Union president. In claiming that Boyle was, quote, in bed with the coal operators, unquote, Yablonsky represented a serious challenge of the status quo leadership and embodied the power of rank-and-file miners, so much so that on New Year's Eve 1969, Yablonsky, his wife, and daughter were murdered in their sleep. The investigation into the crime was protracted and eventually revealed that Boyle had directed and financed the assassination. Following Yablonsky's funeral, the Miners for Democracy, the MFD, a new caucus within the UMWA focused on increasing rank-and-file activism and power, was established. Following the election of MFD candidate Arnold Miller as UMW president in 1972, Another series of wildcat strikes demonstrated the extent to which even an intentional commitment to democracy from union leadership did not preclude complicity with ownership or resistance from workers. Emboldened by the doubling of their profits, the BCOA approached the 74 negotiations with the purpose of weakening the union and decreasing the power of the miners. Particularly important in this respect was their pursuit of, quote, labor stability, unquote, and either circumscribing or eliminating the, quote, right to strike, unquote. When 150,000 workers left the mines in the summer of 1976, they did so in protest over the use of federal court injunctions, arrests, and of fines against wildcat strikers from the Cedar Coal Company in the Kanawha County, West Virginia. As the price of coal declined in the 80s, a number of coal companies responded to the decline in profits by hiring non-union miners. After having dropped to the 15th largest operator, the Pittston Coal Company left the BCOA and took a number of steps in an effort to protect and stabilize their profits, including creating a two-tiered benefit system, doubling health deductibles, instituting a 24-hour schedule, and ending successorship clauses. In 1989, UMWA President Richard Trumka declared a strike against the company, and 2,000 miners across southwest Virginia walked out. While the strike was a quote official unquote union action, and Trumka insisted on peaceful civil disobedience, nearly 37,000 participants were wildcat strikers, and they engaged in more violent actions, including industrial sabotage and armed conflict. Women throughout the region also organized their own groups to support the strike, in turn reminding their contemporaries and those of us taking a historical perspective of the permanent presence of women throughout the region's history of labor militancy. In addition to protesting the Pittston Coal State headquarters and conducting a 36-hour sit-down protest, this group also organized mutual aid for the strikers and their families. Another group identified themselves as the Freedom Fighters and organized Camp Solidarity on land donated by a retired union miner. They established a phone bank and provided housing and food for the strikers. How are we to connect the wildcat strike to the phenomenon of rural space? Do these particular Appalachian examples somehow flow out of the region's more agrarian past? Is militancy, antagonism, and autonomy shaped by the environmental spaces of mountain topography? Can we say that the trees, streams, rocks, animals, the mountains within which the wildcat strike occurs are themselves participants? I argue that the very qualities of the wildcat strike are indelibly connected to the region's topography and ecology. This particular form of labor militancy is rooted, materially and metaphorically, in its rurality. Articulating this argument requires a different way of looking at the term rural, one that focuses on the intersection between A, its etymological root, and B, political practice. Etymologically, rural is derived from the Latin word rus, which can be translated as country or open land, and is theorized to be descended from the Proto-Indo-European ru, meaning to open or space. Throughout this presentation, my sense of rural will draw from both etymological roots, and I will specifically emphasize the characteristic of openness. Connecting the wildcat strike to rural space by incorporating an etymological analysis of rus into a rereading of some specific moments of the former in Appalachia's labor history, I provided a reading of the wildcat strike as a moment of autogestion by focusing on three specific elements: separation, insubordination, and autonomy. In describing the wildcat strike as a moment of autogestion, we should turn to the work of French theorist Henri Lefebvre. For Lefebvre, the moment is a spatio-temporal phenomenon that reintroduces an element of discontinuity into the homogeneity of capitalism and urbanization. If the latter insists on flattening or erasing differences, the distinct memory, content, and form of the moment embodies a, quote, twofold recognition of self and other, unquote, wherein space is reorganized and the everyday is given a certain shape. Lefebvre's attention to the other is important insofar as the moment is understood as a, quote, modality of presence, unquote. Accordingly, it is within the moment that we recognize the other as subject, and are recognized by the other as subject. While the literal definition of autogestion is self-management, a number of scholars have commented on the difficulty of translating the term. in turn noting that this ambiguity is simultaneously a source of confusion and possibility. In many ways, the open-ended quality of the term manifests its content or meaning. For Lefebvre, autogestion evokes a radical conception of democratic representation and space that includes, but is not limited to, worker autonomy. Discussed primarily in the context of his critique and rejection of authoritarian and centralized hierarchies, Lefebvre connects the term to, quote, grassroots democratic control, theoretical essence of freedom, opening toward the possible, means of struggle and reorganization of everyday life, and a new texture of space, unquote. While each point illuminates a specific aspect of the term, taken together, they point towards an image of political activism that situates worker agency and local space at the center of revolutionary moments. The praxis of grassroots militantism, autogestion, embodies the cracks of subversion moments that are necessary for the metamorphosis of our quotidian spaces, everyday life. Russ provides a linguistic resource for articulating the potential for rural resistance to and subversion of the emergencies inherent in capitalist exploitation. Rather than seeing the openness of Russ as a fundamentally vacant space where capitalism can materialize, we should recognize it as a gravitational opening which draws the individual into contact with others through altogether different existential rhythms and materiality. In contrast to the enclosed and compacted character of capitalist exploitation, the Russ evokes space as an expanse, a manifestation, and disclosure of existence. The Russ is expansive because it spreads out the sense of self, and in its capaciousness, rurality makes room for the existence of a manifold of beings. The Russ is therefore both space and sensibility, context and comportment for the becoming of an ontological heterogeneity. Rather than conceiving human subjectivity as invariably turned in on itself or independent of others, the experience of rurality gestures towards a condition for the possibilities of alterity and necessity of interdependence. That mountain or ridge or stone, that tree or leaf or root, that patch of soil or handful of dirt or molecule of earth, they are the spreading out that is the interruptive moment of the wildcat strike. The wildcat strike as an autogested moment was problematic for both capital and union bureaucracy because it entailed an estrangement of labor from the means of production. Here, the estrangement in capitalist production, that of worker from her labor, others, and nature, is turned back on the capitalist system. In refusing to work, the striking miner makes an exit from the spatio-temporal boundaries of industrial resource extraction. The wildcat strike is, in this context, a flight or contraction from the fixed and established power of capitalism. What then is the connection between expanse and separation? Does a decidedly punctuated horizon, like that of the mountains, lend itself to the notion of rural space as spread out? Do we reduce the singular beings of the Russ to a landscape in this connection? Where does the extended unfolding of space occur in topographies of ridge, holler, and valley? Is this interruption of the Russ as expanse compatible with the praxis of separation? Is it contradictory to speak of an expansive space at the limits of what is typically considered civilized space? Does the liminal not convey a terminal point of any expanse? Rather than try to resolve any apparent contradiction in these claims, we need to embrace them more intentionally by insisting on the extent to which the Russ, as expanse, can evoke both a spatial and ontological/existential meaning. The quote, opening out, unquote, of the mountain topography does not occur through a continuous uninterrupted flattening, but is rather a punctuated rhythm of ridges and hollers and valleys. Paradoxically, the expanse of an uneven topography occurs in the breaks, and it is within such spaces that resistance to capitalist exploitation occurs. Perhaps one of the reasons why Appalachian miners were so willingly refused to work is because they carried with them the spatio-temporal memory of separation, however qualified, from capitalist exploitation. Indeed, if, as Lefebvre insists, the moment has a memory and content and form, then perhaps the moments of the wildcat strike are characterized by the memory and content and form of the region's rurality. Consequently, the wildcat strike needs to be connected to the memory of an everyday life and lived space of intimate contact with animal, vegetal, and lithic existence. Accordingly, if the explicit motivation of the, quote, refusal to work, unquote, was directed towards an exodus from the capitalist mode of production, then perhaps an explicit source of this act was the expansive anti-productive character of nature itself. We can read the refusal to work of the wildcat strikers as a thinking like the mountains, what Frederick Neurath describes as, quote, getting away from oneself, breaking away from one's immediate concerns, and in this sense, withdrawing, unquote. The act of withdrawal within the strike constitutes a form of spatio-ontological practice that reappropriates the memory and thus presence of the region's rurality into the present struggle against industrial exploitation. From this perspective, the wildcat strike embodies and reimagines the perceived isolation of the Rus, and the Rus provokes and cultivates the wildcat strike. As a moment of grassroots democracy, it reveals both mountain and mountaineer, effecting an exodus away from an ideological homogeneity towards a manifold sense of belonging. If such is the case, if something of nature, the ridges and hollers, grass and soil, rivers and creeks of the mountains, withdraws from the multifarious forms of human domination and exploitation, does the mountaineer, the human being whose subjectivity is inextricably bound to the mountains, somehow evoke such breakage in her own resistance to the internal and external alienation of capitalist production? To perhaps state it more clearly, does the inherent insubordination of the mountain prefigure the same insubordination of the mountaineer? Is the refusal to be productive in the wildcat strike a manifestation of nature's own refusal? The wildcat strike did not occur in a void, and within this context, the anti-productivity of the act, which is intelligible only within the productive ideology of capitalism, flows out of the anti-productivity of nature itself. To speak of something anti-productive within the land is to recognize and embrace what Neurath describes as the lag, an external and internal constraint within all productivity or creativity, and subsequently that which, whether potentially or actually, breaks capitalism. Describing the land as a manifestation of insubordination, as if the mountains themselves were actively participant in labor strikes, might strike some as odd. To be sure, the land did not organize or march or sabotage in the way that miners, their families, and community members did, nor could we describe the land's insubordination as a causal effect on labor militancy. Nonetheless, we should not deny the material and symbolic impact of the land in regional struggles, least of all because such a move risked perpetuating the anthropocentric ideology that rendered both land and people passive, manipulable, and subject to resource extraction in the first place. Rather, we might speak of a correlative attunement between the human and the environment, wherein the assumed boundaries between the two start to deteriorate and the gravitational pull among them manifests itself in particular ways. Here, as David Abram notes, quote, elemental earth lends us our particular proclivities and gifts, our specific styles of behavior, our ways of moving, our modes of perception, our unique habits of thought and contemplation. Indeed, the depths to which companies saw both the land and people as an obstacle, and thus insubordinate, to their profit-seeking reveals a profound conjunction between mountain and mountaineer. Miners, activists, and community members emerged from and belonged to a land of ridges, hollers, and valleys. They carried within them, even if clouded, the moments of an everyday contact with animals, plants, and stones. They drew on, perhaps unconsciously, the memory and life in the mountains. Those spaces which evoked a literal and figurative intertwining with the environment. Appalachia therefore manifests cracks of resistance that expand and multiply through, as Andrew Mitchell argues, a, quote, letting come that lets it, beings, things, creatures, be at once both more than it is and less than this. More in that it surpasses its bounds in the unfurling of relations that reach out to us and claim us. Less in that it thereby never arrives in full, unquote. The miner is more than his labor. The community is more than a background. The mountain is more than a landscape. Indeed, the insubordination of the wildcat strike can be a negation of the latter category itself. To be exposed in the opening of rural space is to allow oneself to be affected by the entwining of human and other than human existence. It is to subvert the authority, capitalist, urbane, anthropocentric, which would perpetuate the boundary between self and others. Within the spatio-ontological elementality of the Russ, human subjectivity is, potentially, brought to the limits of the self. Perhaps the strike was a form of becoming mountainous. If so, we should see the insubordination of rurality as an opening to the possibility for difference and expression of protean autonomy. The disclosure of an Appalachian Russ opens us to a sense of autonomy as collective and multiple, of black, brown, and white, of queer, straight, and trans, of workers, unemployed, and disabled, of indigenous, migrant, and multi-generational, of human, animal, vegetal, and lithic. We need not repeat the exhausted notion of an untouched wilderness to retain a robust sense of existential or ontological wildness that enfolds the multiple singularities of the region. Can we not see a connection between the fight for breath and life that characterized the Black Lung movement, which was founded by Charles Brooks, and the breath of animals and plants that are expunged from the mountains themselves in the devastation of strip mining and mountaintop removal? Can we not see a connection between the emergent struggles for a liberated sexuality and gender identity and environmental justice pursued by groups like Queer Appalachia and the region's uniquely non-binary fauna like the nematode Awanema rhodensis? Can we not see a connection between the persistent, if colonized and ignored, presence of the region's indigenous peoples and the confused names of the mountains themselves? Are these not expressions of autonomy, of individual and collective self-determination and survival, rooted in both culture and environment? Here we can turn to Andreas Malm's description of an environmental or ecological autonomism as a, quote, ontological fact of uncontrollability as such, unquote. In this context, nature is that which is, quote, ontologically prior to capital, such that however hard various ruling classes have sought to control it, its autonomy persists below the surface, unquote. Malm's emphasis on the subterranean presence of nature's autonomy reminds us that what lies underneath, in both the material and symbolic sense, emerges and grows, whether gradually or immediately. Despite the arrogance of anthropocentrism and the devastation of capitalism, wildness persists. Indeed, the openness of the rush gestures to a similar form of uncertainty and unpredictability characteristic of late 20th century chaos theory. In this context, chaos is used to describe a reality that is, as Alvin Toffler writes, quote, seething and bubbling with change, disorder, and process, unquote. It, nature, strikes back, negates, and at times destroys. And in such chaotic moments, humanity might witness and echo its own forms of wildness and negation, of unpredictability and non-linearity. Does not the punctuated and angular topography of the mountains reveal a non-linear space? Does not the deep time of mountain evolution reveal a non-linear time? Is it possible to embrace and appropriate this non-linearity, this chaos and struggles against the compacted space-time of capitalist exploitation? Perhaps so. Perhaps the wildcat strike reveals what Elizabeth Catt writes of the miners engaged in a week-long struggle against violent exploitation at the Battle of Blair Mountain. Quote, like vines they went, slow and purposeful and of the earth, unquote. What then does the protean autonomy of rural openness disclose? The enfolding of human and natural resistance to oppression and exploitation? The persistence of wildness in circumstances of capitalist development? The environmental poiesis of the wildcat strike? Assuredly so. The autogested moment of the wildcat strike should be seen as an opening, a material and an imaginative space wherein rurality emerges as something more than any traditional identification with landscape or agrarian economy. In the context of the Appalachian Russ, the wildcat strike can be seen as an embodied remembering of a way of life that has been assaulted by, and yet resists, the ideology of capitalism. It is a manifestation, however partial or imperfect, of a spatio-temporal existence in which both individual and communal everyday life was marked by a profound contact with something other than human. Appalachia is the possibility of quotidian insubordination, unfolding in the existential spaces of plurality. Thank you.